Kuzo, sorry. That's your name.
She's muted.
Bonnie, you're muted.
Yes, it is 7:04 and you're live. I was working on making you live.
Thank you. Would you please call the roll?
Sure.
She's muted.
Chair Lappin,
Here.
Vice Chair Overby.
Here.
Yes, it is 7:04 and you're live. I was working on making you live.
Thank
Commissioner
you.
Stanton.
Would you please call the roll? Yeah, he's absent.
Okay, I have some over voice. Just 1 second, please.
Sure. No rush.
Okay, I think we're better now. Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay.
So let's
Let's start the
continue.
roll again. Chair
Sure.
Lappin,
Here.
Vice Chair Overby,
Here.
Commissioner Maskin,
Here.
Commissioner Stanton. No. Commissioner Thomas?
Also absent.
No, absent. Commissioner Deegan?
Here.
Councilmember Reesberger? Can you hear me?
Yep, can hear you.
Okay, let's start the roll again.
Thank you. So let's get into the, I wanted to move things around on the agenda. I'd like to start with the 239M discussion. Just a bit of background during the January meeting, the Planning Commission issued site plan approval for Corning to build an addition to their facility. After.
Hold on, Danny. Hold on. I think there's we're hearing the same thing. We're hearing like the voice feedback.
Yeah, she just muted herself. We should be okay.
Yeah, I
Nope.
think Bonnie's got two computers going there, one possibly on the YouTube channel. So there's a big delay.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay, yeah, so plan approval for the Corning to build an addition to their facility. After the meeting, Commissioner Daigan and Stephen noted that the project site was within 500 feet of the boundary of the town of Oneonta, and as such, we needed to refer the project to Otsego County for a review under General Municipal Law 239M.
Danny, I think you dropped.
Yeah, looks like he's out.
Let's give him a minute. Shane, do you have enough information to continue with the discussion or at least start it, or do you feel we need to wait?
No, I can, sure. Yeah. So,
Oh, wait a second. We don't have a quorum now.
oh, okay. Quorum is 4 members.
That's right.
Isn't technology great? There we go.
There he is.
Back.
You're muted, Danny.
My internet went out. I'm sorry about that. It's been happening. Did you guys talk about the 239M?
We waited for you, but could
Oh, we
you
talked
start
about
over? Because you were
technology.
cutting in and out so much, it was
Oh,
hard to.
sorry about that. So, the background about Corning was that after the Planning Commission meeting in January, Commissioner Daigan and Steve Yearly noted that the project site lay within 500 feet of a municipal border. And as such, we needed to refer the project under General Municipal Law 239M. And so I'd like to pass it on to Stephen for a discussion of what should happen next, if possible.
You're referring it to who though, Danny?
The County Planning Department,
Okay.
as per General Municipal Law 239M.
So basically what happens is the county's required, well, we're required to submit things to the county that are within a certain distance to a municipal boundary. So basically what's happened is we've sent that to the county. We're waiting on a response. I talked to Dave Merzig, kind of as to like what we should do or what his opinion is. Basically what'll happen is the county will provide us with feedback. We would have to then reapprove or, approve with modifications based on what the county sends us.
Yeah, and so that was something we needed to notice. And then as an outgrowth from that discussion, the city signed a waiver with the county where certain projects would not have to be referred to them under General Municipal Law 239M. This is intended to speed up the approval process for certain projects. And and so I wanted to start a discussion about whether we should revisit the waiver form and submit potential, some other projects that may or may not, be worth sending over to the county for a review under 239M. There is a list of criteria that I can send you all as to what would trigger a 239M review. It's usually projects that can affect another municipality, projects which lay within 500 feet of another municipality's border, like the town of Oneonta. Projects that are within 500 feet, I believe, of a county-owned or state-owned road. Is that true, Shane?
Yeah, county roads, county parks, state parks, any county-owned stream or drainage, any county land or any state land, any farm and any farm operation in an ag district, which is none of the city of Oneonta, maybe on the border.
Yeah, so there are very few areas in the city where we would trigger a 239M review, aside from projects that may, let's say on Main Street, which is a state-owned highway, a road, or within 500 feet of the municipal boundary, like the town of Oneonta.
Yeah, it has been common that municipalities kind of forget about this, and I don't think the planning department, I speaking as a staff member, has done a great job kind of informing people about this. So we did create a guidebook recently, and we're trying to kind of revamp the effort. But so don't, it's not just Oneonta that's been missing out. It's, trying to get the word out more.
And so we had done the but I think that it'd be worth for Shane if we could get a copy of the guidebook sent to us. But we may, I think that one possibility for us to visit is that if there is a site plan approval concerning, previously disturbed site, or a that's in addition to an existing structure that triggers site plan review, like the Corning application, that may be worth revisiting the waiver sheet to request certain waivers. And usually the kind of a waiver document is something that we run into as a result of projects being proposed to us. So I think in terms of an action item, it may, if we could, Shane, if you could send us the guide, the 239M guide, and then maybe at a future meeting, we can discuss whether to add, and probably with council's input, whether to add certain items to the waiver list.
Yeah, I'll also send the waiver list, because I don't know if you folks have that, but I can send that as well.
If you could send that, that'd be good.
Danny, can you explain, what do you mean with a waiver? We have the ability to waive this request?
So it's an assigned agreement with the county where certain approval
No.
There he goes.
Uh-oh.
approvals from the city would
I can't hear you, Dan.
So a long story short is the planning commission previously signed a waiver with the county. The zoning board of appeals did as well, that released us from requiring to do a 239M for small site plan approvals, basically, zone, like area variances. I think basically they made a list of things that they were like, these are either low impact, they're type 2 seeker actions, they're low impact type events that the county was like, we don't want to sit around and review garages because they're within 500 feet of a municipal boundary. So they basically signed an agreement with us, giving us the ability to not have to provide a 239M and get 239M review from the county for those projects. Corning, because this is a bigger project, does not fall into that category. I think another thing we might want to review is the code says the clerk's office is supposed to send a 239M form. Being that like the code office is the one doing most of the preliminary review before these projects come in front of the planning commission, it might make sense to just change our code so that my office is sending the 239M form instead of the clerk's office. Just because we get the applications first, like we get them, we review them, we're looking at them first. We can quickly identify projects that would need to go to the county instead of depending on the clerk's office, who, either doesn't know or isn't looking for that particular aspect of the project and is instead just sending out notices to, concerned citizens that are within 200 feet of a project site.
I think that'd be a good idea. That way, by the time you actually have final approval, you don't have to put that off because you're waiting the 30 days. You'll already have it, ideally.
Yeah, I mean, this has happened before just because, I mean, to be honest, like, I'm not looking at stuff the clerk's office looks for in an application, and they aren't looking for, I mean, this is one of those things that their office isn't looking at and they're not looking to do, and it's just kind of, it would make sense that when we just did it as part of our review, we say, hey, or we just notify the clerk's office, hey, by the way, like we put it in the memo, basically, this project requires 239M.
Makes sense.
Do you need us to, I mean, is that something?
Everybody,
you would-
this is Danny.
Sure.
Sorry, my internet cut out, so I'm gonna call in and then try to join on online and see if that works.
Sounds good.
Would we want to
So-
just bundle it all up if we're going to? Does the council have to approve the waivers?
I don't think we've approved the waivers.
We
have
already have a waiver on, someone in 2012 was the last time it was signed, so.
But
Okay.
Yeah,
you-
it was
you
signed
mean
by
to
Dennis
change-
Ben.
Do you mean to change the waiver list?
Yeah,
Yeah, you would need to sign that. I think that maybe the best way is for us to send it out so we all can look at it before the next meeting and.
Yeah.
I don't know,
but I think then we could take Steve's suggestion and kind of bundle it all up.
Yeah, I think that would be good. We can bundle it up, and then once we can just send that back to the county just to get their review and their input, and so Eric Scrivener, who's the interim planning director, can sign.
Okay.
So does that sound good, everybody?
Yeah.
So the next item on the agenda is the proposed zoning changes to MU1. Steve and his team had sent over a series of documents which comprise the new proposed zoning changes to everybody. It was a lot of information, so if Stephen, if you wouldn't mind, if you could give a rundown of the code really quickly, and then we can have a discussion on it. And this is a discussion that will probably last over at least a few meetings. This is a completely different approach to zoning than the 2013 code envisioned. So I'm sure that there will be plenty of discussion items, but this was a big undertaking, and I really commend Stephen on his attention to detail and strong work on this. So we're very grateful for what he did, and I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Okay, so first, has everyone at least got a chance to kind of look at it? To just open it and yeah, a lot of pictures, so it makes for easy reading. So I guess the first topic we would kind of look at here is right out of the gate. If you look at a copy of the map, there's some changes to the physical boundary of the zoning map. We try to color coordinate them so you can kind of see where those changes come from. If you look at the bottom of the map, does everyone have the ability to look at the map while we're in the meeting, or do you need to look at the map while we're in the meeting?
If maybe you could share your screen, Steve, with the map on it.
Okay, let me see here.
if you need, I also have it if you want me to just share my screen so you can talk about it.
Yeah, actually have, because I'm on my
Yeah.
cell phone, so
Sure.
Oh yeah, if you already have that, you can do that. Yeah.
and I don't just carry. Oh, okay, so
Is that, are you seeing the whole thing or is it just, hold on,
Yeah.
here. Okay,
all right? So someone's ready for the meeting at least. So if you look at this map, first, if you look at the bottom, kind of that lavender type color that's over by like Stella Luna's and the Oneonta Performing Arts Center there.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
That one parcel for some reason is zoned commercial. I don't know why half of the parcel is zoned commercial. So there's those parcels are adjacent to one another. They're one zoned MU1, one is zoned commercial. It was one that we kind of felt looking at the map. It doesn't really make sense to zone that commercial industrial when it butts directly to the MU1 zone. The other side of those parcels is kind of the rail line there. So it just makes sense to bring that parcel into the MU1 zone. I'm assuming no one has strong feelings about that, because that would be part of our proposed code change. If you go up to like Grand Street, like the intersection of Main Street and Grand Street, where the Masonic Lodge is there, there's that little tiny parcel back here. It's the one that's hashed in blue and red there. That is zoned, I think it's zoned R4. Yep.
Yeah.
It's zoned R4, but it's part of the Masonic Temple. Like if you didn't know any better and you looked at that property, you wouldn't know that that isn't part of the Masonic Temple's property. The zoning boundary literally goes through the hotel. the motor lodge that's attached to that building. So it doesn't really make sense to zone half a building R4 and half a building MU1. So that's one that we kind of thought would easily be included in the MU1 zone. If you go across the street on Grand Street, all these buildings are all commercial. They front on kind of this MU1 R4 cutoff, but these are all commercially zoned buildings. Again, it doesn't really make sense to have buildings that are fronting on Main Street and they're essentially office buildings zoned residentially, especially at that intersection of Lettuce, Grand, and Main. If you go across the street, you've got basically this little section that goes from Main Street to Walnut Street. You've got the Baptist church, you have a large parking lot, you have the Catholic school, and you have the office buildings for St. James. This entire block is zoned R2. Again, you get into the realm of these lots don't really meet the R2 zone. They're pre-existing structures that are non-conforming that under our current zoning ordinance would basically have no, you'd have to bulldoze them to make them fit the R2 zone. They don't meet any of the, you could use them as a civic, like you could use this as a church, you could use it as a school, but outside of that, you're very limited in use there. And they're right across the street from several buildings that Robinwood is right there. There's a couple other office buildings there. They just, from a zoning perspective, they don't really meet the R2, the intent of the R2 zone. As you go across this backside of Walnut, there's a sorority house, there's the Verizon store or the Verizon office building. There's the YMCA. There's Petrobono's funeral home. There's the old Fox Hospital building that's across from the YMCA. Basically, these buildings that are in the R2 zone that butt to the MU1, they don't meet the intent of the R2 zone. So it just made more sense if we brought those into the MU1 zone and left Walnut as the kind of the line between the R2 and the MU1. That way we minimalized, we didn't actually take a lot of like single family homes. We didn't take buildings out of the R2 zone that were conforming. We basically are just pulling some of these pre-existing non-conforming uses into a zone where they're more conforming. So that kind of just gets us through that part of the does anyone have any questions about that?
So to clarify, so when the proposed changes to the MU1 zoning code also involve a couple of zone changes too.
Right.
Right. Yeah. So I think that it'd be, for the sake of, biting this, I guess, knocking this down into bite-sized pieces. There's multiple components to the proposed zoning change, and many of which, as Steve pointed out, the built environment in Oneonta reflects the proposed changes that he made.
Correct.
So I think I think your reasoning is real well taken. Thank you.
So if I'm seeing this correctly, then the from Elm Street over to Deed Street, you're following the property line behind the houses that front on Walnut Street. Is that right?
Correct. Yeah, the houses that front
Okay.
Walnut Street would remain in the R2 because
Right.
those houses are.
Sure, I got it.
Yeah. So just for everyone's clarification, Walnut Street is a historic district, and we want to protect that.
Okay.
And basically, what this is doing is it's pulling buildings like the YMCA building. That's not really a single family home. The odds of that being turned into a single family home, or I mean,
None.
it doesn't really make sense to maintain the YMCA as an R2 structure. What that building could be used for, or like the Catholic school, you could use those as like, senior living facilities. You could use it like by adding them to the MU1 zone, you create a little more flexibility in their use, and it mirrors what's actually there.
Makes sense.
And then, like I
Great.
said, sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
And then we have that one, like I said originally, that one commercial lot, which, there's minimal reason to have one commercial lot in the MU1 zone. Like that's another one that just, it doesn't, I don't know why that lot is there, why it's zoned that way. So basically what we're trying to do is tidy this map up a little bit and just kind of pull things in that make sense. So are we ready to move forward?
Yeah.
Okay.
Does anybody have any other questions about the map?
Nope.
Okay.
Okay.
Go
So
ahead, Steve.
while we're still looking at the map, you'll see that between Chestnut and Elm Street, there's a section of road that's marked as a storefront is required. There's also a section between Chestnut and South Main Street. The intent of this, our current code has a weird, undefined grade level dwelling unit that it prohibits grade level dwelling units. It doesn't define what those are, and it doesn't really provide an intent. So what we've done with this is we've basically said buildings that front along between Chestnut and Elm Street on Main, and buildings that front between Chestnut and South Main are required to have a storefront. What that allows us to do is areas outside of those road frontages, you can develop into, row housing. You could develop it into, duplexes, residential uses or office uses, but you mandate that you have to have storefront, like retail space, along these sections that are marked that way on the map. So we kind of then, yep.
So these are the sections that have the red outline, the dark red outline.
If you look at the map, there's a section that says storefront required. If it's actually marked on the road, so you'll see that the road is red.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah, I see that.
So
yeah,
is there a depth requirement on that, on the storefront?
yeah, yep. We're gonna get to that. I'm just trying to do a quick layout on the map here, just so everyone can identify what's actually on the map.
Sure.
So that dark stretch of road in those sections indicates areas where you're required to put a retail storefront. If you look at the map, you're going to see some of these parcels are outlined dark red, some of them are outlined blue, and then some of them are just pink. So the areas that are outlined in dark red are Transect Zone 6. The light red portions are Transect Zone 5, and the blue sections are Transect Line 4. So that'll make more sense once we get into the actual code, but these areas all have their own kind of like density requirements, basically. So when we look at this map, the areas that are outlined in dark red are high density. The areas that are pink are a lower density, and then the areas that are blue are essentially like a transitional area. And once we get into the regulating plan section of this, that'll start to make a little more sense. But that's what those color outlines are. The polka dots on the map just show properties that are in the city of Oneonta historic district, the downtown historic district. So as you can see, a lot of our Main Street and a lot of our MU1 zone is in that district. And that's all those overlying areas that have little polka dots on them. Okay, so that's the map. And then if we can go to, I guess we'll just start with the regulating section of it. So there should be a file called yep, that's it. Shane, you're on top of this.
Yeah.
So if we go through, we can skip. Basically, the standards part just kind of describes the point of the code. If we stop there, yeah, just go up one page there. So right here, we have what's called a build to line and the storefront requirement, historic district. And then this places of significance. That's something I kind of wanted to talk to planning commission about. So we'll kind of come back to that later. But so the first A, B, and C just kind of define what you just saw on the map. And then we can go to the next, yeah, right here. So this Transect area kind of explains the intent of Transect zoning, which is basically an idea that you go from an area of intense kind of density and you go out towards areas that are less intense. So like what we define in this code proposal is basically downtown Oneonta is what's called a T6. So it's considered the highest density zone in a urban place. So we go T6, T5, T4. Each of those zones becomes slightly less dense and slightly less intense than the one before it. And basically the idea is that you concentrate development in that T6 and then you move out. Long term, long range, I'd like to see this carried out just through the whole city. So then we could essentially work our zoning down to basically these 6 zones instead of having the zones that we have that are kind of arbitrarily created. This would kind of work as you worked out from Main Street and out from downtown, you essentially work to a lower and lower density depending on kind of what's in the existing environment. So if we go to the next, I think the next slide has actually defines, yeah, right here. So this slide actually defines like what the nature of these neighborhoods are. So as you can see, like T6 is literally our downtown. It's, you know, attached buildings, you know, Main Street, retail, no setback, you know, they're built right to the sidewalk. T5, you know, I included a picture of the Green Earth, Market Street. Like you've got more kind of detached buildings. You've got a mix of single story buildings. You've got a mix of kind of different types of buildings. Some of them have setbacks. Like if you look at Stella Luna's building, you know, there's a significant setback there, but like the Green Earth and Red's Ale House are built to the sidewalk. So it's more of a mix of kind of like built stuff down there. And then if you look at T4, I included Kano because I think that kind of sums up what you're seeing in that T4 area. The T4 area is kind of what we would call like a transitional neighborhood between our heavily built downtown and like Walnut Street. So you see more of a mix of like buildings like the Kano Art Building. You've got like the Unitarian Church in there. You've got a couple converted houses. If you go over to like Elm Street, you know, you've got a sorority house and you've got an office building, and you kind of got more of a mix of stuff in there. And that kind of forms that transitional line between Main Street and Walnut. So the idea is that as you move to like the T4 area, we start allowing, you know, single family homes or homes of that type, detached housing, you know, lower density and lower intensity structures and uses. And then if you go to the next, let's go to the next slide. So this is basically a breakdown of all of the kind of built environment requirements for the code. So this sets up like across the top, you can see T6, T5, T4. So the build to line is basically your setback. So there's no minimum, there's no maximum. So you're basically building to the sidewalk. And then as you get to like T5 and T4, you can see, you know, you get a 10-foot setback. T4, you can get a 20-foot setback. Ideally, you would build anywhere between those two. So instead of having the, like, we have a 5-foot setback, you have to build at 5 feet. This gives you flexibility to say, surrounding buildings are set back 20 feet, you can set back anywhere between the sidewalk and there.
So, Steve, is there any, like, do you feel like we should have any language in there regarding like having a, consistent edge, to the
So-
set built?
That's covered later in one of the design. It's in the design standards.
Okay.
We'll get to that because that's something I did
Okay.
think about. There's properties like Stella Luna's where obviously it's advantageous to maintain a building like that with that setback. But obviously we wouldn't want a new building to be constructed that says, well, Stella Luna's is there, I want to build to that setback line. But yeah, I thought of that, and I think it's in the design standard section.
Okay.
Build to percentage basically says this percent of the building has to be built to that setback line. So in the T6 zone, 95% of your frontage has to be built to the line. What that basically allows for is like forecourts, small plaza areas, basically just very minimal portions of the building can be set back. Retail entrances, could have a minimal setback there. It basically provides like a little bit of deviation from the setback line. And then each zone becomes increasingly less of a requirement to build to that line. Because, places like Kano, we aren't trying to keep those places out of that T4 zone. So we say, you don't have to meet that rigid build to percentage. Side setbacks, same thing. It basically allows you to build attached buildings in any of the zones. Side build to line, same theory. We basically don't, in T6, you don't want a bunch of detached buildings. In the T4 zone, we say, yeah, we want them to be detached. We want them to be transitional. We don't want, a bunch of kind of gang together, high density structures. Same thought with the build to percentage. Rear setbacks, minimal. Nothing really different there. We set the lot and block standard. There's nothing really crazy here. Basically, it just follows. If you look at the average of the existing block patterns and kind of the average of the widths and depths of existing blocks and parcels, it kind of just mirrors some of those. Ideally, what this is there for is so that we don't have like another urban renewal where we try to build super blocks. But honestly, like developing block perimeters in a fairly built up place is, it's basically to prevent another like urban renewal project. It prevents us from building giant super blocks. Building height, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's based on kind of what's already there. The only exception is in the T5 zone. I chose to eliminate single-story buildings. We already have a lot of them down there. It doesn't make sense to really encourage more of that type of development. And then in the T4 zone, we have some one stories. Again, it's meant to be transitional. So what we're thinking there is like, bungalow style houses. Reynolds Street has a collection of like 1.5 story type houses. So yeah, that's pretty self-explanatory though.
So why is it that we don't want one-story buildings in the T5?
Well, so what the goal there would be is attempting to move away from like Sydney Federal Credit Union type buildings. Obviously it's something we can discuss. It's not that this is by no means in stone, but it would seem that buildings like we have the Sydney Federal building. We currently have a lot being used as like a drive-through like bank kiosk. The idea was that we would want to have retail space on the main floor and housing on the second floor. but I mean, that's why we're discussing this. So feel free to, anyone can say anything they want. I'm not saying that this is a
Yeah.
permanent, this is just kind of where we're at right now.
So I
Um,
think it'd be worth, I think it's worth discussing. I'm in favor of encouraging mixed use downtown, and a good way to do that is, especially in terms of encouraging more commercial development and also addressing housing issues, is to have those mixed use structures that have more than one story. It's an efficient use of space and provides more tax revenue to the city coffers than traditional kind of that one-story approach. And the way that it's laid out, if you were to look at it from up high, it would kind of slope downwards too, and have a nice visual transition. And it wouldn't, in the existing one single-story buildings would be are grandfathered in, as I understand it. Is that right, Steve?
yeah, I mean, obviously we wouldn't force anyone to, we'll get to the nonconformity section, but this is just kind of the initial, run through of what these charts and graphs and.
Okay, I want to ask one more question though. What is the rationale for limiting the T6 building height to 5 stories?
So that, again, that's another thing we could talk about. Right now, our tallest building downtown is the Oneana Hotel, has 5 full stories. We could obviously, we could go more than that if we wanted. I base that on kind of just existing conditions. But yeah, if we wanted to say 6 or 10 or whatever we wanted, I guess my thought was we wouldn't want to say it's an unlimited amount where we end up with, a building like kind of Nader Tower,
Yeah,
in a sea of single family homes.
It seems to me though that we could go to 6 or 7 if somebody wanted to build a 6-story building next to the Oneana Hotel. It would only be 1 story higher, and I don't think it'd be out of line.
Yeah, no, like I said, that's why we're discussing this stuff. I based this on our existing maximum height is the Oneana Hotel.
Right.
We can obviously, we can change that. That's an easy change. That's deleting 5 and putting 7 or 6 or.
Yeah,
So,
I think it
I would
maybe,
favor
that.
having the flexibility because it would encourage development.
Sure.
Can
Yeah,
I just
that,
ask why are we what is the concern behind having a Nader just a large, because it would have to be, if you read it would, if someone were to build a huge building like that, they would still have to conform to the historical standards, right? If they're on Main Street. So what would be the downside?
So that's something. So most of our T6 zone is also in the historic district. So like Shane said, most of the T6 is going to be limited by that design standard anyway. So yeah, if we wanted to discuss building a taller building, we obviously can. Some of this stuff I went conservative on just because it's a starting point. And that's, yeah, like I said, we can change whatever we want.
Yeah, and it may be worth visiting that. I think there should be I think there should be a max height, definitely. But yeah, it'd be worth kicking. Yeah, it'd be worth kicking a few around. We only need to look at how Nader Tower sits in relation to the, 6th Ward as it is, and it's, totally out of character for the neighborhood. And I think it very, having 7 or whatever, any number could be, but I think we should probably start from a max height that we're not okay with, and then, go down from there to something that we would be more fine.
So that's right. So, and like I said, that's a very easy change. So we established the finished ground floor. So we actually get to establishing when we say, instead of saying grade level, well, we've established, these are the required elevations above grade. And then the last in the encroachment section there, you see a couple different like frontage types. And those basically just define like what frontage types are allowed in each zone. So if you look at like T6, you see awnings that obviously kind of go with our shop front thing. Galleries, which we really don't have any, but they're neat, they're interesting. Balconies, forecourts. I mean, and then as you get into this T4, you know, we start allowing like porches and stoops and less formal entry types. So then if we go to the next series of slides are literally just illustrations of those concepts. So it's just taking you back through and showing you kind of what all those numbers mean when you look at it on a piece of paper. So yeah, that's, you've got your building heights here. But yeah, it's basically just kind of outlining what we just discussed. Yeah, that's, you know, a lot of pictures, lots of illustrations. So actually, if you stop right here on this one, this illustrates that build to concept. So that section that's marked A, that's basically just showing you that kind of what that setback concept looks like. So the dotted line there is kind of where your maximum, that's like the right of way. And then anywhere within that shaded area becomes where you can land that building. So that's kind of what we were talking about with that concept of not necessarily having a setback that you have to build at, but more of a zone or range of area where you can build within.
Just to point out that the importance of having diagrams like these, compared to our existing code, this makes it much more easy to understand what the city is expecting from a developer's perspective. So these are clear terms that are commonly used. The dimensions are clearly explained so that when we see site plans, we're much more likely to see plans that comply with what the city's expecting, as opposed to the traditional code, which is purely textual, aside from the zoning map.
And again, these are, I mean, I made these illustrations, so we can always add to them. We can take away from them. I mean, these are like made in-house, custom made for us. So like we can, you know, if we want to add, you know, a 7-story building, we can remake this diagram with 7 stories. You know, it's not, or if someone looks at these and goes, you know, I don't get it, we can always, you know, we can always change them. So yeah, so that's basically just kind of the picture version of the chart we looked at. There's kind of more of it. Yep, more of it. So if you look at this T4 one, that's kind of illustrating the concept of like a stoop, you know. But again, it's just kind of illustrations of the concepts that were in the chart. Like nothing too crazy. And then in the next section, I think we keep scrolling. This kind of addresses the non-conforming concepts. Initially, what we say is historic buildings, we kind of say they're considered conforming to the zone, even if they don't meet. So like Stella Luna's wouldn't meet the setback requirement, but we don't really want it to meet the setback requirement. It's kind of there in its own right. Some of the buildings that maybe don't meet, I can't even think of any outside of that one. The idea is that we essentially grandfather and we say anything on the historic that's on the National Register, not the materials, but the way the building's situated and the current you know, height, setback, whatever physical characteristics define it are acceptable within the zone. Same with the non-conforming lots and blocks. Basically what I did was I pulled an old Sanborn fire map, and that Sanborn fire insurance map shows kind of the original downtown layout. We basically say that's what we're looking to maintain. We don't want to take anything away from it. If anything, we want to bring it more into conformance with what that map shows, which basically would be like the reconstruction of like Broad Street. And then it closes out the lots and blocks section by saying you can only bring something more in compliance with the code. You can't make anything less conforming to that standard. We can't make any new blocks like the Clarion sits on or the Sydney Federal's on. We basically restrict development patterns to returning to the pre-existing street layout. So that's pretty much it. Then if we keep going down here, non-conforming structures, non-conforming uses, I mean, it's basically a standard kind of boilerplate. You can't make a building or a structure or use more non-conforming. Anything that is non-conforming can't be expanded. It can't be built on. If it's damaged beyond 50% of its value, it has to be made in compliance with the code. They're fairly boilerplate. I don't want to say generic, but it's kind of the going standard for non-conforming structures and uses. And if we go, that might be most of this. And then this is that map. So this basically shows us kind of what the street layout is, and it's pretty much intact other than obviously Broad Street. There's a couple little kind of little paths in there that we have moved, but for the most part, like the general street setup is still the same. And that's basically that's kind of the introduction as to how this whole thing works. The big takeaway is T6 is your main your main density, intensity, and then it feathers out to that T4 zone as you get more towards the R2. I guess the next section we could look at would be the uses, because it's pretty short and quick.
Steven, I just have a quick question for you.
Yep.
This is just kind of a naming question, but why are we calling them T4 through 6? Like if we don't have 1 through 3, is that a standard somewhere?
Yeah. So basically, Transect Zoning is based on the idea of an urban transect. It's like a smart code, and they organize things T1 through T6. So basically, this is just building off of what, I don't want to say it's an industry standard, but it's a concept that is used in this type of zoning specifically. And ideally, what we would do is long term is we would develop those T1 through 3 zones as we do the other sections of the city.
Yes, if I could just add, it's the Transect Zoning is one that's kind of supported by this organization called the Center for Applied Transect Studies, and they created this kind of open source manual for municipalities to use when considering form-based codes. And so they created this T1 through T6 approach, and so that's kind of what this code mirrors. And that whole open source code is a form-based code, and the bones of which are available. If you look up the Center for Applied Transect Studies, you can kind of see the foundation from what from how those proposed changes are being derived from.
Yeah. So that T1 through 6 is basically, they made essentially like a model code. They've made a lot of modules that they spin off of that. Some of them are really good, and some of them are really good if you're in the right place. Some of it's stuff that we don't super need because we don't have a lot of we don't have a lot of a land to like redevelop or to develop. We mostly have a lot of existing buildings. So some of that stuff they have is great. Some of it's not so useful. What I try to do is build kind of off that smart code concept, but make it a little more kind of dialed in for what we have here in the city of Oneonta. ideally what I would like to see happen is we would get rid of the MU1 and it would just be T6, T5, T4, and those zoning districts that we've created, like the R1, R2, and would just become those T1, T2, T3. We would build that out so that long term you would no longer have an MU1 and MU2. Those would go away and just become exactly what they are, which is T6, T5, T4, and so on. But this was just kind of this is where we're starting, I guess.
Okay, thanks.
So the next section we have is land use. It's pretty, it's weird because ideally we want to just kind of get rid of use-based zoning, but that's not entirely possible. So what I did was I took, being that I'm also the code enforcement officer, the building code in New York State has a really, what I think is a pretty smart way of handling uses for occupants. They basically have like big categories, and then they have examples within those categories of what classifies an assembly, what's classified as a business, what's classified as educational. So what I did was I took those New York State use categories, and I said in the MU1 zone, you can do any of those things. You could have an assembly, you could have a business, you could have an educational use, you can have residential. The building code of New York State provides tons of examples of what each of those categories are. And what I did was I said, okay, so in a T4, we obviously don't want a tavern, a bar, a nightclub, adult uses, or casinos butted up to Walnut Street. So I use those as an example of what wouldn't be permitted. And in each of these zones, what you see in the red, these are uses that we would say probably don't meet the intent of that Transect zone. So like, you probably don't want a prison in the T4 zone. It's an example of a use you wouldn't have. There are institutional uses that maybe would be permitted there. And then as you go towards T6, you get away from some of the, you're allowed to do more intense uses. And then in the T5 zone, you're allowed to do maybe like more flexible uses. So like drive-through car washes don't really fit anywhere in our downtown, but an automotive repair shop maybe would. So like these uses are flexible. If you guys are like, hey, I think a nightclub would be a great thing to put in the T4 zone. Or maybe you're like, Steve, I think you're insane. Like, detox facilities would be great downtown. It's what these are meant to be are examples of things we're looking for and examples of things we are not looking for. So if you build out this, if you go to the next slide, the next page of this, it basically says these are permitted use categories. It gives you it gives you the definition that the state code provides. And then the second one is items that are not allowed, which is the NP. Then if you go to the next page, you get into accessory uses and compatibility. The idea here is that if someone has a use that they really think fits our intent, they can always request the planning commission to give them an opinion on it. So that compatibility section, that's kind of where I see you guys coming into play. Like, let's say I want to open a, random thing number 5. And the code enforcement officer says, you know what, I don't think that meets the code. They can request a site plan review. You guys can provide written determination that the use that this person's proposing is in fact meets the intent of our code. The idea is that we provide flexibility to people and we kind of get away from saying, well, so for example, the city of Oneonta right now, we don't allow like solar farms, like solar fields. They're not listed specifically as permitted, so they're not allowed. they're prohibited. This is trying to get away from that and get more into, we've identified things that we know we don't necessarily want in that zone, but we're giving people the ability to like kind of pitch it.
So this would be, so for example, Steven, so this would apply to stuff like mother-in-law units on
Right.
houses
Yep.
and home occupation.
Correct.
So that would really free up a lot of the, opportunities for, T4 and T5 then, if you're talking home occupation and then mother-in-law units and stuff like that for housing.
The
which
things
is,
that, the examples that were used in the not permitted section are things that I think are clearly not meeting the intent of the zone. So a T4, a department store, it clearly doesn't meet the intent or the existing pattern of development that's there. So that would work in the T6. Brazee's was a department store. Woolworth was a department store. I mean, those meet, if someone could meet the design standards and put a Target in, I'm not saying that's ideally what we're looking for, but it wouldn't be entirely out of place in that environment. However, where Kano is probably would be a bad fit for a department store. Gas stations, they don't really meet our intent. On Market Street, could I see a gas station with pumps in the rear and all the parking in the rear? Sure, why not? But we aren't looking for that like in a T4 zone, which is budding residential, and we're not looking for that downtown. So basically what it's doing is the not permitted section, the NPs, are things that I think just don't meet the intent of the zone.
So VIX would be a non-conforming legal use then, right?
What do you mean?
VIX service station.
Let me look here. So VIX is in a T5. So VIX is outside of our downtown.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So VIX would be allowed.
Yeah. So the idea is that T5 area, the biggest area of downtown, we know we have gas stations there. And honestly, the intent of that zone is to allow flexibility of use. So we say, yeah, we need gas stations, we need auto repair shops, we need stuff like that. That works like in a T5. Does it necessarily work? Like, do we want to bulldoze, a building on Main Street so we can put in a gas station? Probably not. Do we want to put a gas station like where the comic book store in the Dietz lot is? Probably not. I mean, so basically the T5 follows that code intent. Flexible, a mixed range of building types, building setbacks, building heights, kind of a, more of a flow of stuff. And then the T4, we keep pseudo residential, pseudo low intensity, kind of a transitional zone between Walnut Street and downtown. So it does restrict some of those uses a little more than what's in the current code. The current code treats the entire MU1 zone as one homogeneous blob. So you could put a gas station where Kano is now. It treats the entire thing as one big chunk, which isn't the reality of what's there.
Yeah, I think that I think that one of the key things that we need to focus on as a commission is that, Stephen, you refer a lot to the intent of the different transects. And so for us, as we review projects downtown, we really have to keep, I think it'd be worth keeping a written record of what we deem is the intent of each transect, so that it's consistent as different members transition in and out. So people term limit in and out.
Shane, do you mind going back to that regulating plan file real quick? And then if you scroll up, kind of all the way to the top, there's a definition that, actually go down. Yeah. So A, B, and C kind of provides kind of a, you know, a 1,000-foot view of what each of those zones kind of is supposed to be.
Location is 21 miles to the southwest.
That's like the intent and purpose right there, A, B, and C.
Yeah, I think it's more of the, I'm referring to like the use. So if there's a use that's being proposed there, and it's requiring site plan approval, it'd be worth like kind of mentioning that how it fits into each transect it's proposed in. So that way we have a kind of consistent view of what's going in where and why. That's what it kind of seems like to me. Since the zoning designations are flexible, I think it's, you know, important that we have a consistent interpretation of what, you know, what we're, you know, agreeing upon. That way it's written down, so that when people will say, oh, you know, you guys interpreted, defined, this proposed use one way, and then now I'm proposing the same thing, you change your mind. You know, I don't want to, I think that consistency will, will help here.
And then if you go back to the uses file, I think in that compatibility section, if we go to the down again in the so that gives you kind of a little bit of like what these kind of like what that looks like.
Can I ask why in the T4 zone? I'll go back down to that in a sec. I just wonder why some of these like group homes, halfway houses, residential board care. I mean, isn't that the zone where we, or the transect rather, where we mentioned the YMCA was, and possibly some other large buildings that could potentially be, I think you mentioned one owned by Bassett, I think is in that.
Yeah. So again, this is the part where you guys have, I mean, you have input on the whole thing. When I looked at potential uses that maybe wouldn't fit that zone, I looked at what was kind of already there. We don't have any residential like medical facilities in the zone. Obviously, if we wanted to say like, I mean, like St. Mary's School, like that would be probably a perfectly acceptable type of building. It would probably be easy to convert to, a rehabilitation center or a group home or a, like something like Springbrook could use that for because they do have some in the R2 zone. So yeah, I mean, that's totally up to you guys.
Yeah, I think that one, maybe, it's worth bringing up Shane brings up a good kind of question, maybe be worth having the discussion about, having facilities that care to those who are in need, located close to downtown, close to where there's employment opportunities and is relatively walkable rather than outside.
Right.
Yeah, I think it'd be worth having a discussion about that. I know that there's, the county office building on Main Street provides mental health services, and then there's Catholic Charities, Fordu, and others, within the downtown space. It'd be worth having that discussion, perhaps, as to whether to allow it. I think that, as Steve said, there's plenty of opportunity for change, but that's something that we should consider. I'd be open to.
And I mean, that's actually in our comprehensive plan as well. So I mean, that's something that we could argue. Like the comprehensive plan does call for basically creating more spaces and more service, access points for members of our community. So like that would be compatible with our comprehensive plan. Again, the only reason I put it in that list is we don't have anything there already.
I think that's worth having. It's worth additional discussion. I think largely because from an equity perspective, you want services to be available to those without cars, and so being able to walk into our densest part of our city is probably better than having it on the outskirts where you need a car to go or you need buses to go.
And that's an example of like sorry.
I'm not sure that we want to prohibit recovery facilities anywhere.
Right. And I agree with that. You know, I think we had an example with RSS with their project in the 6th Ward. I mean, maybe a building like, I mean, I don't want this to be on record that I think the YMCA is going to close or anything like that. But, you know, a building like the YMCA, a building like St. Mary's, some of the larger houses, like Petrobono's funeral home, those might be good fits for that type of use. And that's obviously something we can discuss. I mean, that's, again, when I made this, those were examples. They can be easily moved around.
Yeah, I think that maybe, you know, in terms of an action item, so we can keep moving through the code, is that we should, you know, prepare comments, you know, suggested changes, and then include them, you know, proposed changes, you know, maybe in written form would be, or bulleted form, whichever is easier, and have that brought to like future planning commission meetings, so that way you can make changes through the code.
Yep.
It's my understanding that, you know, council, the planning committee and the council will also be discussing this once we're done too, right?
Right.
And so
Yeah,
there's going to be ample rounds for revision, but I think that being able to take our time and offer some constructive changes, you know, will ultimately benefit the code. So this is great.
I mean, the ideal thing too is that we're talking about this now because we all know something about this process. The less ambiguity that we have in this code, the better. Because when this goes in front of the legislative committee, when this goes in front of the city council, I mean, we're the content experts on this in the realm of the city's review process. So if we don't kind of fill in any holes or make any changes, it's going to be up to someone that maybe doesn't know as much as we do.
Yeah, so I think that, you know, maybe, you know, if I had the ability to assign homework, we should take a look at the Transect, you know, table, especially around the uses, and maybe shop around a few changes. And if you see any line edits or any sort of other suggestions within the code, is to share them with Steve, and just kind of make them known. You know, and then when we have, you know, obtain, you know, revisions, it's important that we, you know, enter some suggested changes into the record so that, you know, there's a clear public transcript of what we discussed, as well. Yeah.
Cool. So that's the idea behind the compatibility and accessory use section, is that basically the planning commission can provide site plan review and permit uses that aren't defined specifically within the code.
So really quick, you know, so that would be, you know, if someone were to have a question about the interpretation, rather than going before the ZBA, they could come before us.
Right. Yeah, the concept would be is that, let's say I was like, I want to open like an artisanal chair factory downtown. As the code officer, I might say, you know what? I don't know if that use specifically meets the intent of the downtown zone. They could go to site plan review. You guys could review it. They could say, here's where what I'm going to do. My factory section is going to be here. I'm going to have a retail space here. I'm going to, you know, they could provide basically a site plan application, and you guys could say, yeah, I think that meets the intent of the code based on this, this, and this. The idea would be is we get away from the zoning board of appeals, and this is true for any municipality, not just ours, issuing variances. Because the problem with variances are they're I don't want to say arbitrary, but they can become very arbitrary very quickly. It turns into just issuing variances to make stuff happen because we didn't plan for it in the code. And it's kind of a hodgepodge way to do zoning.
Yeah, and the problem with the variance is that they run with the land, so that if a project were to, you know, if ownership of a building were to change and the use of the building would change, the variance stays.
Right.
What would be the role of the ZBA if we adopted this within the MU1 district?
Yeah, I was gonna ask that too.
The role of the zoning board of appeals would be the last stop before we got sued. The role of
So
zoning
if
board,
they, if, so in the event that the planning commission finds that a building does not meet the compatibility requirements, they're free to request a use variance from the ZBA. They're also free, if there's an issue of bulk or dimensionality, they're also free to request an area variance too, or a combination thereof.
so basically, like, let's say I wanted to open a gentleman's club downtown. Our code is, and this is up to you guys as well. Our code is historically not allowed for adult uses downtown. I come in front of the planning commission and say, you know what? I think I can run a gentleman's club that has no more of an impact than any other allowed use. I think I can do it tastefully, whatever. The planning commission says, no way, Jose. I can then go to the zoning board and request a use variance. I can be like, I know my use doesn't meet the intent of the code, but I have a unique hardship that allows me relief from the zoning code. And then that's what their job would be. That's what their job should be anyway. So yeah.
So this was, I think this is basically a way to allow the city to use a zoning code, as a more flexible tool than what the bureaucracy, red tape kind of provisions in our code currently allow, where you have two bodies that can issue site plan approvals. Now we have basically one. I think. And so there's a question. So that would kind of lead to another question: is would the ZBA then, also be able to issue site plan approval still in MU1?
Yeah. So the whole
Afterward.
point of this, you'll notice as we move throughout this code, there's a lot of the planning commission will provide written determination. The planning commission will provide facts of finding or findings of facts. The idea is that we're only going to the zoning board when we have a use or a physical characteristic at the property that requires a variance. We're trying to use the zoning code as a zoning code, not as what we have right now is a very black and white document. It says this is allowed, anything that's not on this list is prohibited. This is a requirement. Anything that falls outside of this is prohibited. There's no flexibility within the code. So we end up defaulting all the time to, we need to get zoning variances. So by providing exceptions within the code, we can provide relief from the written, we can provide relief, and I don't even want to use the word relief. We can provide exceptions to the code by using exercises of logic. Like, we can look at the code and say, the intent of this code is to allow someone to open a bespoke chair facility that makes really high-end furniture and has a small retail presence on Main Street, instead of being like, we are going to give a use variance so you can always run a factory in this building, whether that factory makes pesticides or whether that factory makes bespoke chairs. It takes us out of that use variance or nothing world that our code kind of runs in right now.
Yeah, so I think that that's a really important piece, and I'm glad that it's in there.
What does number 2 under accessory uses say? It's not quite big enough for me to read from here.
You can't build an accessory use and say that you're going to build a principal use later. So basically what that's in there for is, you can't buy a lot, build a shed on it, and say that you're going to use it for something else later.
Oh, okay. You've got a typo in there. That's supposed to be prior. Right?
Yeah, so it should be prior instead of priory.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. Now I understand. Yeah.
And then I think the last section on there is just the site plan review process. And that's kind of just, it mimics our existing site plan triggering effects. I did go ahead and clear up so one of the things that came up during the DRI review is, what is a 25% change in a facade? Our code doesn't say, it doesn't define what that means. So there was really no kind of verbiage as to Is it 25% of a story? Is it 25% of the overall facade? Is it 25% of the windows? Is it gross area? I mean, there was really nothing to flesh that out. So in this section, I basically I kind of defined some of those conditions a little better.
So then I guess there's a couple of things that under the facade changes, it talks about changes affecting 25% of the entire building. Well, that items 1 through 3, that should be, I think you mean affecting with an A, right?
Let me see here. Oh, yep. Yes.
And so I guess the other thing is under 2A, it says facade changes of more than 25% of a principal facade. And then it says changes may not be done in section will be reviewed cumulatively. And so that's kind of, we're trying to encourage applicants theoretically to, kind of explain their whole vision for the facade to us at once.
Right.
Not just like take little sections. So kind of like Seeker, where we're trying to get rid of segmentation or avoid segmentation. Okay.
Yeah. The idea is that we basically say you can't do 2 windows now and 2 windows in a month and 2 windows. The idea is that we keep everything as kind of one review. So yeah, I mean, that's, yeah. And then at the bottom, it kind of clarifies with the compatibility. Basically, existing uses, New York State Building Code, Chapter 3 occupancy, which is where all those examples come from, and the comprehensive plan. So it kind of provides like a framework of, potential documents to draw up of when we do a compatibility review with the uses.
Great. So does anybody have any further questions on this section?
I guess my just a general question is, it sounds like, you want this to be the idea is to make this citywide. I guess, why are we doing this only as the MU1 section first and then the others? Well, I'm just worried that could create some confusion in the process if there's a kind of a very different process for the downtown area versus everywhere else. Is that just because it, just takes time to?
Yeah, I mean, so we have to get here has taken a long time. COVID kind of really messed that up as well. We're kind of just now getting back to kind of a normal operating capacity. I think that once we get, so like right now our zoning code, we have an MU1, we have an MU2. So I think most of the MU2 would just become a Transect 5. So there wouldn't be a new section of code written. Those zones would just be changed to T5. We have an R4 zone. Again, I don't think we would be writing a new section of code. We'd just be changing R4 to T4. So we're already eradicating like decent sections of the city with this section of code. That would just be a legislative change.
So what would the transect for the rail yards be?
So
Be
what
1,
we would
2, or
probably
3?
end up doing there with rail yards, so the commercial zones and the schools would probably be special zoning districts. We would have to write, we would basically use the GEIS to develop basically a zoning code for that site.
So it wouldn't be T1 through 6 then.
Well,
Could I have like a PDD down there?
yeah. So basically, a special zoning district, you develop those as like a planned development district. I mean, if we wanted to be crazy, we could assign that as a T1 because that's really what it is. But obviously, that would be, against what the city identified in their comprehensive planning documents is kind of what they want that site to be. So
And-
yeah, zones like that fall outside of the 1 through 6 category are just basically assigned their own special zoning districts.
And I think that going back to Shane's question, so if we were to go to like a Transect zoning model with, you know, special development districts, would be eventually eyeing, you know, a transition away from like Euclidean zoning as a whole and moving more towards form-based codes for consistency, or would we, you know, is that,
Yeah, I
you know,
mean,
as a long-term?
I think what we would end up doing is, like I said, you know, the MU2 zone just becomes a Transect 5. We've already written code for it. The R4 zones that we have now would just essentially become T4 zones because we already have we've written that code section up now. And yeah, those would just kind of move. And then as you get into like our R2 zones, we would just write similar, you know, design standards, but essentially this is kind of the heavy hauling area of the code because this is where we have our most, the widest, we have the most use, like the most, like collection of uses, building types, kind of just weird stuff is all in these kind of T4 through T6. Those
Yeah,
lower,
I mean, this is like the heart. So basically, this is like the heart or nucleus of the city, and then all the other zoning changes will eventually emanate from downtown outward.
Yeah, those other zoning districts, I mean, your uses are going to be essentially, you know, residential. There's not going to be a ton of review because they're mostly residential, you know, multifamily, 2-family, single-family homes. You don't have kind of the density that we have downtown. You don't have the uses we have downtown. You don't have the parking and the kind of the stuff that goes along with this more dense zone. So I think those areas would I think we can move through those pretty quickly, just because there's not a ton of stuff there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that'd be good. So the would you mind going over the transportation section? I think it's parking under Shane's. I think that's another thing that's worth paying attention to in light of the Dietz Street project and others, and recent discussions about parking and transportation downtown.
So a lot of what we have in the transportation section, what we're trying to get away from in the downtown zone, well, honestly, everywhere. So large developments, kind of like what we have with like the lofts on Dietz, they'd be required to present a transportation plan. The goal with that would be is for them to show compliance with the seeker review and the site plan review process. But what we would be getting away from is mandatory parking minimums. And that's kind of sums up our, like, the goal of this code is to get rid of parking minimums and to move towards developers providing parking, developers showing where they meet the parking requirement, people utilizing parking that already exists, as well as a drive for bicycle parking. So there's a fairly large section about mandating bicycle parking, just so that we can start incorporating that into our downtown. But most of the intent of the code is pushing for less dependency on, you know, single use car trips. And I don't know how much of this you guys have gone through yourselves or, yeah.
I think that's you know, it's a lot to, you know, what we've gone through is a lot tonight to digest. But I think as we move forward, that since we've gone over the use area in quite a bit of detail, I think this section is also really important to consider, particularly in light of the DRI and the numerous kind of transportation projects that the city is considering at this time. I guess
a couple other things that are in this section of code. It prevents you from demolishing buildings to build surface parking. It requires parking be located in the rear of structures. It makes the parking accessible from streets or alleys. So we get away from the intent is to keep automobile uses and automobile storage and automobile circulation as a secondary to pedestrian and like pedestrian uses and alternative transportation uses. So that's kind of the big drive. What we don't want to do is we don't want to find ourselves every 6 months or every 2 years counting parking spaces so that we can show we meet an arbitrary number, which is a waste of everybody's time. It's a waste of the developer's time. It's a waste of the city's time. It leads to pointless litigation.
And then frankly, worrying about parking often adds substantial cost to the engineering design component of a project too. And then oftentimes you'll end up with parking lots that are actually bigger than the structure itself. So in terms of encouraging dense development downtown, we have to kind of embrace every form of transportation.
The idea of this,
purely auto-oriented.
I know I'm new to this, so I just want to clarify. The idea is to, I'm imagining, allow more Dietz loft style projects to develop and not have to be so concerned about having X number of parking spots. Is that?
Yeah. So if you
if someone wanted to come in and build an apartment building on Main Street and a bigger one, they wouldn't have to find the spot somewhere to create.
If you look at the building that the Latte Lounge is in, there's that entire building on the second floor and the third floor is vacant. There's no housing in it. If you turned that all into housing, you would not be able to meet the parking minimums in the current code. The only way to meet those parking minimums would be to bulldoze like the Clarion Hotel. And I mean, obviously, we don't want to find ourselves in a quest to meet the parking minimum by bulldozing every other building so we can meet the parking minimum.
So it's not just a future concern, it's something preventing development right now.
Right.
Yeah. It does. And then also it's important to remember the fact that a lot of these parking minimums, the numbers themselves are relatively arbitrary, and they're done by a national organization, and they focus on municipalities a lot larger than ours. And so it's basically a one-size-shirt-fits-all approach to development, which kind of creates this huge kind of auto-oriented structure. So if you ever want to go do a deep dive, there's a book called The High Cost of Free Parking. It's about 800 pages long of parking stuff. So if you ever want to test your commitment to the field of planning, you can read it. I have a copy, so I can lend it to you. But it's I think that, the issue now is you want to increase the flexibility and ease of which developers can come in and build in Oneonta, not worry about something like parking, and not open ourselves to litigation related to parking.
Yeah, I agree. I was just wondering. Sounds.
Yeah.
The other important thing to note is so bigger projects like the Lofts on Dietz project, they would still be required to have an engineered plan for transportation. They would that's part of this transportation and circulation plan. The idea is they would be showing the planning commission, we get it, parking could be a thing. Here's what we've done to research it. We have a traffic study. We have a we have some sort of planning document showing that parking has been considered in our development. But what we don't want to do is say, sorry, we have to deny your site plan because you don't have 96.24 parking spaces. The only place that I did include parking, like a minimum, is with bicycle parking, and only because we really just don't have it. I mean, again, it's flexible. It only requires a certain amount. Once you hit a certain number, it's, you know, you don't have to continue to meet it. It can be shared. It can be, there's a whole section on bike parking. Ideally, long term, you know, 10 years from now, you don't have to mandate it anymore because people just assume that people use bikes. But for now, it's just one of those things that we really just we don't have a way to control. There's also our code now doesn't define how parking lots should be surfaced. It doesn't define how parking lots should be landscaped. There's really nothing. There's nothing providing any sort of like regulatory guidance on how any of this stuff is supposed to be set up. So this code kind of builds on that. I included, actually where Shane is now, there's a parking garage there, that Art Deco parking garage. This parking garage above it is all those commercial buildings are actually built into a parking garage. So yeah, there's a lot of cool stuff out there that you can do that other communities are doing to accommodate parking. But you know, if you let people just build surface parking, that's what they'll do.
Yeah, and I think that from the DRI perspective, this section provides a lot of guidance for projects like the transit hub and also the parking garage renovation.
Right.
That we normally wouldn't have. So when we ask, an architect or engineer to provide designs, they have a much clearer perspective of what the city prefers than they traditionally would.
Danny, this is Dan Maskin. I'm going to need to step off pretty soon. Are we
Sure.
bringing anything to a vote tonight?
No, I mean, I think we just wanted to go over, start the discussion on the code. It is,
Okay.
we're approaching 2 hours, so it's been a long meeting, but I think that what I would ask is to just continue to go over the code.
Okay.
And with it, to wrap up, Steve, so what do you anticipate as a timeline on next steps on the review process?
So right now, I'm cleaning up the sign section. And I'm also doing the so there's a section that's like administrative that says like, you know, these are the reviewing bodies. This is who enforces it. This is who. So there's kind of that like generic like administration and enforcement section. I'll give that to you guys to look at. It's not like, I mean, I'm sure everyone here has seen that section of any, like any municipal code. Definitions, kind of generic, you know, like I would call it like the bits and bobs section. But yeah, other than that, I mean, it's pretty, I'm basically just waiting for like anything you guys see that you want changed, built on, kind of, you know.
So I think that there's 2 action items that can come out of this. One is to continue to review the code and identify changes or questions that you have and send them along to Steve. The other would be to wait until we have the entire code in its entirety and to look at it, and then kind of comment on it. But I think that, you know, as I said earlier, I think this is a review that will span, you know, a few meetings at least, and so I don't expect you guys to get this all at once, but let's just start going. Go ahead.
So I would say like the sections you have right now, are the meat and potato, like actual outside of that sign ordinance, which our whole sign code is kind of a mess. So I'm trying to like pick it apart. But like, this is the main, I mean, these are the main chapters. Like, these are the areas that I think will have the most, like the most comment on. I mean, the administration part, it literally is just like the code office enforces the zoning code. This is the intent of the zoning code. Like, the planning commission is allowed to do this, this, and this. I mean, there will be some stuff in there, but like, this is your kind of like your heavy lifting. Like, this is the part that's like the actual nuts and bolts of how this code will function.
Steve, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Is there any way that we can write into the code? Is there a way that we can encourage net zero carbon considerations in the structure? I mean,
Yeah.
I don't favor making it a requirement because
right,
that just scares off developers. But if there's a way we could incentivize it or encourage it, I think we should.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the kind of stuff that like we can obviously, like in the design section of the code, we can write in that, you know, certain size developments have to provide, you know, some sort of compliance or review, or I mean, we can put whatever we want in. I mean, I've kind of gotten into this with the environmental board. The New York State's environmental code is it's not oppressive, but it's rigorous. I mean, the environmental code is a thing we enforce now. So there is some regulation already in existence just with the state building code. But yeah, I mean, we could definitely write in that, you know, projects that exceed a certain floor area, you know, square feet, provide some sort of, you know, energy plan. A lot of municipalities have done it. I mean, it's not uncommon.
So yeah, I think that that's a really good suggestion, and I think that we should pay special attention to that. I think that, you know, incorporating that into the code would also open up more grant opportunities for the city through the Climate Smart Communities or Clean Energy Communities program. So I think what I'd like to see, you know, heading into next meeting is to get some, you know, changes in writing, send them over to Steve. We'll go over them in March, and does that sound good, everybody?
Yep.
Okay, and make sure that, you know, when you send, when you have the changes, make sure you just include everybody in the correspondence related to the code. That way we're all kind of on the same page, not sending the same emails. And then, yeah, and so I just wanted again to thank you, and Steve, you did a really good job explaining the code, and thank everybody for sitting through very, you know, a long meeting, but I think that this is a big change in the city, and the more attention we pay now to the code, the more it'll pay off in the long run. So thanks everybody for taking
Very
time.
good.
And thank you, Steve. This is
Okay.
a humongous amount of work, and we're really grateful for everything you did.
Yeah.
Good night, everyone.
Great job.
Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Right. Thank you for your patience
Bye.
and your technical.
So the meeting's adjourned at 8:48. Yeah. So good night.